This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Neer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find all about it on our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom of the page and you'll see a big red button that says Patreon. Click on it and support us. We're counting on you. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin. Every week we talk about books and research and fascinating things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Nir Arielli. He is an associate professor of international history at the University of Leeds in the UK. Today we'll be discussing his latest book, From Byron to Bin Laden, A History of Foreign War Volunteers, published by Harvard University Press in 2017. Nir Arielli, welcome back to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Again.
Let
me ask you about this phenomenon that you have identified and defined of foreign war volunteers, people getting up from the countries where they live and going to foreign lands to fight foreign wars. How do you define this phenomenon? Because there's such a wide range of people and motivations that you cover.
The definition in itself is a challenge always, and I could potentially include quite a lot of people in this. So I decided to focus on people who, as you said, leave their home to go fight abroad. They leave the fight without being sent by their government. They do so on the basis of a personal decision, and we can talk about ideology, we can talk about the circumstances in their lives, but it does come from kind of their own decision rather than being sent to fight abroad. So there are quite a few cases of people who were sent abroad as supposedly volunteers, but in fact are instruments of foreign policy of their governments. The foreign volunteers I look at are not. And also I'm interested in people who go not primarily to make a profit. So I'm not interested in classic mercenaries. I'm not interested in private contractors. I'm interested in people who go usually on the basis of an ideal that they want to fight for.
Speaking of ideals, these are wonderful personal stories. I mean, these people are interesting. And, we're getting used to seeing people start their books with a personal story of how you got interested in this topic. So I was curious about that. I mean, I have a personal hero who is a foreign war volunteer fighter, Simone Weil, of course, the French intellectual who joined the Spanish Civil War, where she succeeded in stepping into a pot of boiling oil and injuring herself. She's my personal hero. Do you have one of these that you really just love?
Well, of course, like many others, I like the works of George Orwell. He's a fantastic writer.
No, I didn't say I don't like the works of George Orwell. We could talk about that too.
Yeah, but the phenomenon captures a great variety of people. So some of them are quite admirable. So when I was working on the book, people say, oh yes, the Spanish Civil War, Che Guevara is often very popular. But on the other end of the spectrum, there's some mean individuals.
Some mean individuals. Tell us about one.
Well, from the first page of the book, there's Mohammed Emwazi, for instance, right? So Jihadi John, born in Kuwait, raised in London, travels to Syria, joins the Islamic State, and becomes their chief executioner and kind of propaganda hero. So he's just one example of some foreign volunteers who are committed, but at least from a Western perspective, symbolize evil rather than good.
I want to go back to a word that cropped up a few times during the very short time we've had this conversation, and that is phenomenon. And I would like you to justify your choice, your methodological choice, in treating this as a phenomenon rather than, a motley crew of circumstantial and situational episodes that amounted to, do they amount to something greater than the sum of their parts?
Well, you make an excellent point. There are great differences between the people I look at. I look at different historical periods. I look at people responding to different conflicts, to different ideologies, and people even kind of using different technologies to travel to and to conduct war throughout more than 200 years. But at least from the perspective of international law, of political science, they do have something in common. So all of them go to travel to fight abroad on the basis of an idea. All of them do so without the blessing of their government. all of them almost to challenge the state's sovereignty. So this is a person taking upon themselves the prerogative of the government to declare war, right? So this is something unique.
This is an interesting question from a perspective of sovereignty. How do they actually challenge state sovereignty if they're going as private individuals, not as representative of their government by definition?
Well, starting from the late 18th century and increasingly through the 19th and 20th century, the states have taken more and more responsibilities upon themselves. One of those is to restrict the ability of their citizens to go and fight abroad.
At least independently.
Yes. So in many countries, in the US, for instance, in Britain, going to fight abroad without the consent of the government is criminalized. In the US, you even risk losing your citizenship. By doing so, they're making a political statement.
So basically your premise, your thesis is that it's a properly modern phenomenon. It's something that has to do with the way, with our modern understanding of what a state is, what citizenship is.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So I'd like to ask you on this, how is it different from, say, the Crusades?
Right. So if you look at the Crusaders, as far as we can tell from the historical sources that we have, in terms of the psychological mechanisms that are at work, they're not that different, right? People are moved by something that's happening in a foreign country and decide to take it upon themselves to go and fight for the cause. So far, so good. Not much of a difference between, let's say, modern-day foreign volunteers. What has changed is the international political context. In the medieval kingdoms, there wasn't the expectation that you only fight for your state, right?
Because there were none.
There were none. And the kingdoms didn't have the same capacities that modern states do. They didn't have the legal framework. None of that existed. Whereas starting from the French Revolution onwards, there is a growing expectation that if one goes out to fight, then that should be for one's nation.
I find this fascinating because we usually think of the French Revolution as the moment that brought into the world, values of enlightenment, liberalism, universalism. And your emphasis on the nationalism side of it really makes almost an ironic point that at the same time, we see the birth of the state that creates nationalist loyalty out of the very same revolution.
There's a great paradox in the French Revolution. On the one hand, it espouses the ideals of liberty. And this is something that transcends the border of France, and the revolutionary leaders seek to see the rest of Europe certainly undergo a similar transition. But on the other hand, there's something very nationalistic about it, la patrie, right? Fighting for the homeland. And there is a moment in 1793 when France is engaged in war with several enemies, where the revolutionary leaders decide that it's not enough to rely on volunteers, and this is the first time they try to conscript the whole population to defend the republic. So there's a paradox there between the national and the transnational.
I mean, it just made me think of this advent of people actually wishing to fight for their country, the soldier citizen, where you fight not because you're just conscripted by a king and you have to, but because you're supposed to want to die for your country. And you would say that is really a turning point that leads us into the modern condition.
Absolutely. And already after the French Revolution and increasingly in other countries in the decades that followed, we see suddenly the people who die in battle are celebrated. They become national heroes. We see the Arc de Triomphe in Paris.
And the Great Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which will be the fodder for an entire book about nationalism later.
Exactly. So George Mosse, the great historian, called this shrines of national worship. They begin to emerge in the 19th century, and by the 20th century, they are pretty much a global thing.
By focusing on this age of ideology, as it were, do you feel that there wasn't some sort of like a pitfall that you could fall into, that your analysis would somehow be integrated in the idealization and folklorization of foreign volunteers? How do you tackle that as a researcher, as a historian?
Well, what I tried to do in the book is I saw it at one stage as an onion that you have to peel the layers. So you start with the ideology because the ideology is there and it's important, and probably things would look very differently without these ideologies. But once you peel the ideology away and you start looking at individual volunteers, you see that their motivations are much more complex. So they're fighting for a number of reasons. Some of them are related to the cause, some of them relate to their own predicaments.
Can you elaborate on that, on the different motivations?
One example I could give is what sort of historians of migration have called push and pull factors. So that they're pulled by ideology, the appeal, perhaps the solidarity, perhaps also by the lure of adventure. But they're also pushed. The push could be very different. One case study I looked at is the communist volunteers who came from Mandate Palestine and went to fight in the Spanish Civil War. They were pushed quite significantly. They were a marginal group in Zionist Mandate Palestine. They were anti-Zionist, so the Zionist establishment didn't like them. The British Mandate authorities were concerned about them, perhaps in an exaggerated fashion, and
because they were communists.
Because they were communists, criminalized their activities, and they were constantly under the threat of being arrested and perhaps even being deported from Palestine. And on top of that, once the Arab revolt in Palestine breaks out in 1936, there's also a lot of tension within the Communist Party between Jewish and Arab members. So people who wanted to leave Palestine, but leave Palestine with their heads up high, could go and fight in the Spanish Civil War, and quite a few of them did.
I find it another interesting contradiction in a way that this phenomenon, which started with nationalism in a way, that gave us the idea and the glory of fighting for a nation, led to such a transnational ideological force that led people to fight on behalf of causes that had nothing to do with their own nation.
Of course.
Is that paradox?
It is, yes. And I suppose in the 19th century there was nothing more international than nationalism, especially in the first half of the century.
See, that is so cool.
That's what NEAR is here for.
Nationalism was associated more with what we would now call the left.
That is not cool. So just kidding, go on.
It was a liberal challenge to the monarchies that ruled much of Europe. It's only in the later part of the 19th century that nationalism moves to the right. I think that sort of solidarity between emerging nations, or between the aspiration to have more nations become liberated, was a very strong motivator, at least until the First World War. After that, the paradigm shifts, and we have to start thinking about more rigid terms of left and right. And we see the big causes, like the Spanish Civil War, like the Second World War, are battles between the right and the left. And both of them managed to attract foreign volunteers.
Tell us about your other waves of ideology and war that drew foreign volunteers.
Well, I think, according to my understanding, this second wave lasts until the end of the Cold War.
The second wave being the left-right.
Yes, so we start the first wave being, I called it liberty versus tyranny. The second wave, from let's say 1917 until the collapse of the Soviet Union, is a wave of right versus left. The third wave actually starts before the end of the Cold War, but gains momentum later on. And this, I borrow Samuel Huntington's famous saying, the clash of civilizations. Now, I should clarify.
Before we ask you to justify this.
I am not a clash of civilization kind of guy, but the volunteers are. The volunteers do see the world in terms of defending my civilization. A lot of the Islamist foreign fighters, foreign volunteers that we see in recent decades, they are very much thinking in terms of defending the Ummah.
Focusing on the individual motivations and the role of ideology in society, it seems to me like your study is more like, sort of political sociology or social psychology even, rather than, a historical study per se. Is that fair?
Well, that's another challenge I face with this book. When I was writing it, it was the height of the Islamic State, and there was a lot of commentary, especially by sort of political scientists, IR specialists, sociologists, talking about the phenomenon of foreign fighters. And I come as a historian with a different kind of toolbox and try to add something historical to the debate by looking at the past, by trying to see what we can learn from previous examples, both in terms of similarities and in terms of differences. I do draw on an interdisciplinary literature when I write this. I do use some psychologists, I do use quite a lot of political scientists, etc. But I still think of myself and of my methodology as being historical.
How is it different from more social scientific endeavors?
Well, one of the things that I learned by looking at the past is that there is a slight tendency to exaggerate both the importance and the threat posed by so-called foreign fighters. The UN defines them as foreign terrorist fighters. I think that's a conflation of two different things.
Wait, the UN defines the phenomenon that you're looking at as terrorists?
The UN sat down a few years ago and tried to define what the foreign fighters going to join, particularly the Islamic State in Syria, were. And they came up with this title of foreign terrorist fighters. To me, it seems a bit strange because the people thinking about going to Syria, in theory at least, have a decision to make. Right? There's a famous article in the field that's called "Should I Stay or Should I Go?" Should I stay and fight the West where I live? Or should I go and fight abroad and help co-religionists who are suffering? And it's apparently much easier to make the decision to go and fight abroad than it is to stay and commit an act of terror in your home state. So hence the conflation.
Yeah, because if they're just joining an active military conflict, they're not necessarily targeting civilians, which is what terror is.
The problem begins with some foreign fighters who came back from Syria and were involved in terrorist attacks in Europe, most famously the attacks in 2015 in Paris, in Bataclan, which had a number of ex-foreign fighters who were involved in this attack.
And what about historically, volunteers who joined paramilitaries or even foreign terrorist groups or international terrorist groups?
Well, the precedent that people usually fall back on is Afghanistan in the 1980s. So there was a huge movement of people going to Afghanistan to help the Afghan Mujahideen to fight against the Soviet Union that had invaded Afghanistan. Some of these went on to form Al-Qaeda, most famously Osama bin Laden. Some of these were later implicated in terrorist attacks in their home states. So that is the historical precedent. However, I argue that if you look at history, usually foreign volunteers, foreign fighters are not a threat. They become a threat to their regimes only when they go abroad with the express desire to gain experience in order to go back home to fight.
Well, this leads us to some of what I think are the interesting distinctions between the different kinds of people. I mean, when you look at stories like Kosciuszko, not just a bridge in New York, or Lafayette, people who came, from Poland and France, respectively, to fight in the American Revolution, and the difference between them and like American Jews who went to fight in 1948 in Israel, or Arabs from the Middle East, or Kosovar Albanians who went back to fight in Kosovo in 1999 after growing up in the U.S. Aren't we looking at quite different situations where somebody who has no personal ethnic or political connection to the country they go to fight for goes, as opposed to somebody who is already organically, deeply spiritually connected to a place?
Yes, so I come up with 4 categories of understanding foreign volunteers. I don't look specifically at their motivations per se, but rather I look at how they position themselves in relation to the country they come from. So some of them I call self-appointed ambassadors. These are people who are angry at what their government is doing.
Their home government.
Their home government. So the British government in the 1930s, standing on the sidelines during the Spanish Civil War, people on the left in Britain were upset with non-intervention, and some of them, few of them, go to Spain to fight and make a statement. I'm representing the true attributes of what it is to be British. So those are self-appointed ambassadors. And perhaps we can think about people like Lafayette that you mentioned as another self-appointed ambassador. Then there are diaspora volunteers. And here the Jews who came to Israel in 1948 are a very good example. It's not so much that they are not loyal to their home state, but rather at that moment in time, their identity as Jews is more important than being American or South African or British or French.
Or possibly a pan-regional identity, like somebody from a Latin American country, for example, an Argentine who goes to fight for Cuba or Bolivia, just as a random example.
Yeah, and that brings me on to the third category. So sometimes you have people perceiving the borders of the states where they live as unjust, right? So if you look at Italy, in the middle of the 19th century. Italy is divided into different sort of kingdoms and principalities, and you have a strong, consistent movement of people trying to fight against it and willing to go abroad, as it were, to fight for it. So very famously, Giuseppe Garibaldi, the great Italian hero, lands in Sicily in 1860 to liberate it. He is, to all intents and purposes, a foreigner when he's doing it. So I call them cross-border volunteers. And finally, there are the real troublemakers, who I call substitute conflict volunteers. So these are German anti-Nazis who had to flee from Germany after 1933, after Hitler comes to power. They sit in France, they sit in Czechoslovakia as exiles, and then the Spanish Civil War breaks out. And this is their opportunity to fight fascism, as they say, with guns in our hands. And the true ambition is not only to defeat the fascists in Spain, but also to go back and defeat them in Germany and in Italy.
I think that one of the most interesting aspects of your book is where you do try to get into their psychological depths, and you find that one of the real unifying factors between them is that these are all people who are searching for meaning. You draw on a wonderful book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. The only thing is that as a social scientist myself, I'm wondering what distinguishes them from every other human being who is searching for meaning.
Well, you're absolutely correct in saying that, yes, in a way, we're all searching for meaning, aren't we? But we're talking about individuals who are unable to, for any number of reasons, unable to find meaning in their present situation. And then a conflict abroad breaks out. Obviously, it's a conflict that attracts a lot of attention. Usually, the media plays a large role in that. And this is an opportunity for people to go there to do something that they see as right, that makes them feel good about themselves, gives them purpose, but also makes them look good and respectable in the eyes of the people they care about. The people they care about could be members of their party, could be co-religionists, could be family members. It varies.
What is it really about violent conflict that makes it such an effective rallying cry? I mean, because, for them, meaning is fighting, as you said, with guns in their hands.
You know this well, Gilad, that war is an attractive thing, right? In popular culture as well. I mean, most of the films we see are films about conflict, about war, either real or imagined. So there is the fascination with warfare, more generally. So there is an attraction there. I think in pretty much all the people I talk about, there is a sense of adventurism there.
Especially since 99.999% of them are men. Maybe I exaggerate slightly.
Yes, there's a vast majority of men, absolutely. I estimate at least 90%, in some cases, in others more than that. Yes, this is overwhelmingly a masculine phenomenon.
But that brings me to one of the other rather interesting commonalities that I think came up a lot in your book, and I'm not sure if you really focused on it, but many of them simply that's what they know how to do. They were ex-soldiers. Many of them had a military background, had fought in World War I or II, and then said, well, I miss the adrenaline. It reminds me of, war correspondents who can't really adjust, or for that matter, political consultants who spend their time working on political campaigns, and we live on adrenaline, and people get addicted to that.
I can think of one random example.
No.
Some of the foreign volunteers that I mentioned, absolutely. They're ex-soldiers, and this is what they do best. For others, this is just an opportunity, a fantasy. One of the men I interviewed for the book was from Britain. He volunteered to fight for Croatia in 1991 during the Yugoslav wars. Now, this is a guy who had been turned down by the British military for some medical reasons. So the opportunity wasn't there. But then when the war in Yugoslavia broke out, this was an opportunity. So something he saw as just, but also personally gratifying.
The flip side of war heroes, or war heroes in their own eyes, is disillusionment. To what extent do you see that in the cases that you cover?
Absolutely, yes. This was something that struck me really when I started diving into the historical cases, that disillusionment is a very common response, perhaps even more common than radicalization. So in a lot of cases, we see often young, idealistic people arrive in the war zone and finding something completely different than what they expected. And the classic example is, of course, the Greek struggle for independence in the 1820s, famously Lord Byron, etc. You had hundreds of Europeans coming to Greece and expecting to see heroes from the Greek mythology and being utterly disappointed with the reality that they met and going back where it was possible to go back, utterly disillusioned.
So with all this fantasy and idealization in mind, to what extent did they actually make considerable military contribution to the conflicts that they traveled to join?
This is perhaps the greatest myth that I try to address and to a certain extent bust with this book. Foreign volunteers sometimes do make a real difference. They make a real difference here in 1948 by, for instance, helping to establish the Israeli Air Force, but that is the exception rather than the rule. Usually they encounter a lot of difficulties and fail to make a substantial difference, both because of their numbers, which aren't big enough, and also because of language difficulties and not knowing the terrain and not being used to the climate. Where they do have a substantial impact is in terms of propaganda. Because they're international, because they attract a lot of attention, they help to draw international attention to conflicts, and they help, in some cases, raise local morale as well.
It's very interesting. I want to go back to, again, this personal psychology of their motivation. And you quote Gustav Regler, a German World War I soldier who went to fight in the Spanish Civil War. It's a very poignant quote because you write that he was aching to kind of simplify all these complex dilemmas in his life and go somewhere where there would be a very simple cause that he could join. And I think that it's this yearning for a simple yes or no, I can make a difference, to Gilad's question, or the Greek, the great romantic Greek struggle. There's going to be simple answers, heroes and villains. I'm going to be on the winning side of history. And I think that it's this deterioration of that simplicity that I find fascinating. I don't know what my question is, but I think it's an interesting insight about not only the search for meaning, but how these people are searching for meaning and what happens to that search.
Yes, the volunteers, by and large, see the conflicts they join in very simple, basic terms of good versus evil. And often when they reach the war zone, that reality no longer holds.
Turns out it's just as complex everywhere else.
Yeah, so the goodies are not necessarily the goodies, the baddies are baddies, but perhaps not the only baddies.
Or if they're the goodies, they're fighting each other.
Exactly, and infighting has plagued a lot of the causes that I look at, whether it's in Yugoslavia in the 90s, in Greece in the 1820s. Infighting is often a serious problem for the volunteers. They do not expect to see that.
So what are we to do with this world of complexity?
Maybe start a podcast.
Arielli's, or maybe just read Nir Arielli's book. That's obviously Nir Arielli talking about foreign volunteers. Thank you for being on the show. And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Now a request. Many of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review right there. You can support us also by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. And any of you are welcome to check out our archive. We have almost 500 interviews. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. We're called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.